Welcome to our study of Daniel, session 13. We are in chapter 11, beginning with verses 9 through 12. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. All right, excuse me. His sons, the phrase his sons points to the sons of the king of the north. The king was Seleucus Calenius, and his sons were Ceraunus and Antiochus the Great. After Ceraunus was killed by a fall from a horse, the Great became king. Antiochus the Great became king and tried to acquire the territory of Egypt. Now, history clearly bears out what we have just noted and associated with verse 10. That leads to a question about the meaning of verse 9. Excuse me. The King James translates this verse, "So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his land." Now, according to Scroggie, this may mean either that Ptolemy Euergetes successfully returned to Egypt after his invasion of the north, or that Seleucus Callinicus of the north, having unsuccessfully invaded Egypt, returned defeated to Syria. Well, then the American Standard of 1901 translates it this way: "And he shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but he shall return into his own land." Now that makes it sound as if the he is the king of the north. And then the New King James translates it, "And the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land." So they assume that it is the king of the north that is being spoken of here, going into the kingdom of the south. Now, verses 11 and 12 speak of the king of the north, Ptolemy Philopator, being so enraged that he directed an army of 75,000 into the field of battle. Antiochus commanded an army of 78,000, but though his army was somewhat greater in number, he sustained a severe defeat in the initial battle. No fewer than 10,000 of his men were slain in battle, and Antiochus's army was given over to Ptolemy Philopator. The cities of Soela, Syria, and Palestine hastened to submit themselves to Ptolemy. That is according to Turner. Now, according to Scroggie, Philopator, had he pressed his victory, might have possessed the kingdom of Antiochus, but pride and licentious indulgence prevented him doing this, and so he was not strengthened by his victory at Raphia. So that's what we see in verses 9 through 12. Now, verses 13 through 19 says, "For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. Now in verse 13, Scroggie makes this comment: Antiochus the Great entered into an alliance with Philip III of Macedon to partition Egypt between them. The Syrian king attacked Egypt with a larger army than he had 14 years before. And one result of this was that Antiochus gained possession of all Palestine. Now verse 14, Turner makes this comment: Thy people is the people of Daniel, or the Jews. Any Jews that gave themselves to being involved in robbery or other immoral activities with Antiochus or others shall fall. The case is that in that period of history, when the wars raged between the north, that is Syria, and the south, Egypt, Palestine lay between the two. In short, Palestine was the chief seat of the wars, and the Jews were often torn between the north and the south. Now in verses 15 and 16, the king of the south is still Antiochus the Great as he battles against Ptolemy Epiphanes, king of the south. The beautiful land, or the glorious land, as some translations have in verse 16, is obviously Palestine. And again, Turner makes this comment. He says, a number of Ptolemy's subordinate rulers were preferring the authority of Antiochus over that of Ptolemy. Josephus wrote, the Jews of their own accord went over to him, that is Antiochus the Great, and received him into the city, Jerusalem, and gave plentiful provision to all his army and to his elephants, and readily assisted him when he besieged the garrison which was in the citadel of Jerusalem. That's Turner, page 236. Now in verse 17, Scroggie says, Antiochus gathered all his forces on land and sea with a view to invading and conquering Egypt. But the Egyptians had sought and obtained the interference of the Romans, which led Antiochus to change his policy. Turner goes on to say, Antiochus the Great would petition the authorities of Egypt for a merging of the powers of Egypt and Syria into one nation, and that such a merger would be a great protection to both against the Roman power. At that point in time, Egypt's king was Ptolemy Epiphanes, the son of the late Ptolemy Philopator, a lad then 7 years of age. Some historians report 4 years of age. Antiochus the Great was proposing a marriage of young Ptolemy with his young daughter Cleopatra. The marriage was to be consummated when the couple were of marriageable age. Further, Antiochus proposed to give Suella Syria and Palestine as his daughter's dowry. The marriage contract was made in 197 BC, and the marriage was consummated 4 years later. The year was 193 BC. Scroggie further comments and says concerning the phrase, he says, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him, verse 17. He said, instead of Cleopatra going against her Egyptian husband and helping her father, the king of Syria, she stood with her husband. That is, Antiochus's design being that she should work for her father against her husband. But this did not happen. On the contrary, when Scipio defeated Antiochus at Magnesia in 190 BC, Cleopatra sent congratulations to the Romans. Now we come to verses 18 and 19. Scroggie makes this comment. He says, Antiochus turned his conquests against the isles of the Mediterranean Sea, and he took possession of the dominions of Philip of Macedon and crossed into Europe and seized Thrace. The Romans demanded that he should get out of Philip's former dominions. He refused, but a prince, Scipio of Rome, resisted him and turned the reproach back on the Syrians' head. After his defeat at Magnesia, Antiochus fled from fort to fort on his way back to Antioch. A heavy tax was imposed upon him by the Romans, and in order to raise the money, he assaulted with an armed force by night the temple of Jove in Elymas, but the inhabitants slew him and all his forces. Now, I know that this is a lot of detail, but basically what we're coming down to is the fact that all of these prophecies are very well shown in history to have occurred. Now, let me just throw in something here at this point. A lot of people want to take the book of Daniel because it was so correct in its prophecy, and they want to do this with all prophecy. Actually, they want to put the book, or at least these portions, as being written after these events happened, because they deny the miraculous. They deny the gift of prophecy, and therefore they say, well, there's no way that a man could predict these things, especially with such accuracy, unless he wrote this after, or it was written and claimed to be written by Daniel after the events that are prophesied. The same is true of the prophecies of Isaiah, Ezekiel, anything that can be shown in secular history to have been fulfilled. They want to deny it, and they want to therefore deny the inspiration of Scripture and prophecy in general. Let's go on and read verse 20. It says, and then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. Now, in this verse, Turner makes these comments. He says, after the death of Antiochus the Great, one of his sons, Seleucus Philopater, succeeded him. Seleucus' fourth Philopater fell lot to the great indebtedness that his father had incurred just prior to his death. That is, his father's indebtedness fell to him to repay. He reigned only 11 years in contrast to his father's reign of 37 years. This new king, Seleucus IV, was being pressed by the Romans to come with tax money which his late father had agreed to pay. And the press was so great that he, on learning that there was untold sums of money in the treasury of the temple at Jerusalem, appointed Heliodorus to make a journey to Jerusalem under color of visiting the cities of Suella, Syria, and Phoenicia, but in actuality to execute the king's purpose, that is, to collect tax money. In time, Heliodorus, because of the king's commandment given him, announced that in any case this money must be confiscated for the king's treasury. This is found in 2 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 6 through 13. In turn, Heliodorus, in his desire to raise himself to a place of royal dignity, poisoned Seleucus IV Philopater. In the meantime, when Antiochus IV Epiphanes learned of the death of his brother, Seleucus Philopater, he came forward with his claim to the throne. He gave himself the name Epiphanes, a name which meant glorious. his desire was that the people regard him as being God. And that is what verse 20 is referring to. Now, verses 21 to 39, in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim, will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action, for he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is spoken of here, and as we said earlier, the Jews changed his name to Epimanes, which means the madman. The vile person is who this is here in verse 21. This section also speaks of his flatteries and his working deceitfully. We've already noted that he well fits the description of the little horn that would grow out of the Greek Empire back in chapter 8. Note again here his atrocities against God's people. Now Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, wrote much about Antiochus IV, and we've already noted this before, but let's reiterate it here. He vandalized the temple in Jerusalem and left it bare. He forbade the Jews to offer daily sacrifices. He burned down the finest buildings of the city. He built an idol on top of Jehovah's altar. He slew swine and offered them upon the altar. He compelled the Jews to forsake the worship commanded in the law of Moses. He compelled the Jews to raise idol altars in every city and village and to offer swine on them every day. He forbade the Jews from circumcising their sons, and those who did not obey his orders he caused to be whipped with rods and torn to pieces. And the women who did have their sons circumcised, he ordered them strangled, hanging their sons around their necks as the women were dying. And finally, he destroyed all the sacred books of the law that he could find. Again, that's according to Rex Turner, pages 165 and 166 of his commentary. Now in verse 21, Scroggie comments on this by saying, he was not the heir to the throne, as his brother, the former king, had a son, Demetrius, who was the rightful heir. He seized the throne at a time when the people were living carelessly and by intrigue and political favor. Now in verse 24, Turner comments, as a rule, kings and governors respected the people's religious commitments relative to their temples, shrines, and the like. But not so with this contemptible person, for he shall regard only himself. And then Scroggie says on this verse, Antiochus, wherever he went, scattered gifts. The booty he gathered in one place, he scattered in another. Now in verses 25 to 27, in verse 25, Turner says, Antiochus would make elaborate plans militarily with which to invade Egypt, for he continued to be head-bent on bringing Egypt under his rule. This king of the south was Ptolemy Physcon, or Euergetes, the brother of Ptolemy Philometor, whom Antiochus IV Epiphanes held in his possession under the pretense of supporting his claim to the throne of Egypt over the claim of his brother Physcon. On verses 25 and 26, Scroggie says, Antiochus Epiphanes made war with Ptolemy Philometor and speedily defeated his forces. He advanced to Memphis and marched toward Alexandria. Ptolemy's defeat was the result of internal intrigue, including that of his brother Physcon, who replaced him on the throne. Treachery and intrigue caused the overthrow of Ptolemy and the defeat of his army. On verse 27, Turner says, the two kings expressed their interest and loyalty for each other, but the overriding purpose of Antiochus IV Epiphanes was to make himself sole king of Egypt, while the overriding desire and purpose of Ptolemy was to save his brother Physcon, who had usurped the throne, removed, and the rule of Egypt committed to him. Now in verse 28, we see Antiochus IV Epiphanes' activities in Jerusalem among the Jews. Scroggie says he and his refer to Antiochus. The event relates to the Jews. Onias III had been removed from the high priesthood by the treachery of his brother Jason, and 3 years later Jason was displaced by Menelaus, who had Onias murdered and plundered the temple. The Jews rose to defend their sanctuary, and much confusion resulted. Now, again, according to Scroggie, Jason unsuccessfully attempted to recover the high priesthood. Antiochus was in Egypt, and it was rumored in Judea that he was dead, which led to much rejoicing among the Jews. Antiochus heard of this and marched against the Jews in Jerusalem. 3 days of wholesale massacre followed. Antiochus desecrated and robbed the temple and returned to Antioch. This information is found in 1 Maccabees 1, 20 through 24, and 2 Maccabees 5, 1 through 21. Now, Clark makes comment on these verses and says, and hearing that there had been a report of his death, at which the citizens of Jerusalem had made great rejoicings, he was determined to take a severe revenge. Antiochus brought a great army against Jerusalem, took it by storm, slew 40,000 of the inhabitants. Sold as many more for slaves, boiled swine's flesh, and sprinkled the temple and the altar with the broth. Broke into the Holy of Holies, took away the golden vessels and other sacred treasures. Again, 1 Maccabees 1:24 and 2 Maccabees 5:21. On verse 29, this was at least the third time, and perhaps the fourth, that Antiochus invaded Egypt. Scroggie says Antiochus again attacked Egypt, but not with the success he had the first time or the second time. The object was to break up the alliance between Philometor and Physgon. Now in verse 30, Scroggie says it was in BC 168 that Antiochus invaded Egypt. The Ptolemies appealed to Rome. When Antiochus was within 4 miles of Alexandria, he learned that a Roman fleet lay at anchor in the bay. He was met by Caius Popilius Laenus, who handed him a demand from the Roman Senate to leave Egypt. Antiochus said that with his advisors he would consider it, whereupon Linus drew a circle around him and said, "Before you step out of that circle, give such an answer as I may report to the Senate." The king replied, "If it so please the Senate, we must depart." So grieved, he returned. On his way north, he satiated his fury upon the Jews, making use of renegade Jews, and it was at this time that he committed these outrages and massacres for which he is so justly infamous. Now, Adam Clarke adds to these comments by saying, on the particular comment, have indignation against the Holy Covenant, in verse 30. He says, "For he vented his rage against the Jews, and he sent his general, Apollonius, with 22,000 men against Jerusalem, plundered and set fire to the city, pulled down the houses round about it, slew much of the people, and built a castle on an eminence that commanded the temple, and slew multitudes of the poor people who had come up to worship, polluted every place, so that the temple service was totally abandoned, and all the people fled from the city. And when he returned to Antioch, he published a decree that all should conform to the Grecian worship, and the Jewish worship was totally abrogated, or done away with, and the temple itself consecrated to Jupiter Olympius. How great must the wickedness of the people have been when God could tolerate this? In the transacting of these matters he had intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant, with wicked Menelaus the high priest, and the apostate Jews united with him, who gave from time to time such information to Antiochus as excited him against Jerusalem, the temple, and the people." This information can be found in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 41 and verse 62. It's also confirmed by Josephus in his Wars, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 1. Now, in verse 31, Turner says, Antiochus IV Epiphanes fulfilled this projection here in verse 31 by placing his altar upon God's altar, and then he offered a sow, a pig, a female pig, as a sacrifice upon that altar, the abomination that makes desolate. Then on verses 32 to 35, we see that some of the Jews that desired to take in Greek culture, they supported and sided with Antiochus. However, some of the Jews, a remnant, remained faithful and opposed Antiochus. Now, Scroggie says this refers to the uprising and resistance of the Maccabees. The period of the Maccabees, beginning in BC 165, lasted nearly 100 years, and this story is told in 1 Maccabees. Scroggie also says in the Maccabean crisis arose a class of pious and learned men called Maskilim, the understanding ones. They did not fight but taught, throwing light upon the messianic promises. The army of Antiochus attacked a multitude of Jews on the Sabbath day, a day on which the Jews would not fight, so they fell an easy prey to their enemies. When success crowned the arms of Judas, some joined the Maccabees, who formerly were opposed to them, but their attachment was not genuine. Macias says this about this passage. But in spite of all that had happened to the Jews in Jerusalem by the hands of Antiochus the soldiers, there were some Jews who were willing to suffer come what may. Some Jews even took the time to teach others the holy will of God. For doing this, many of the Jews were killed. But in the midst of all these troublesome times, someone came to the aid of the Jews, someone of the Maccabean family, Judas Maccabeus. He tried to help the Jews for a period of 6 years. But as we read in verse 35 of Daniel 11, all of these troublesome times were necessary to separate the faithful Jews from those who were not. It was necessary to separate the godly Jews from the hypocrites. Finally, on these verses, Scroggie says, Judas and his successors were not always faithful, and many fell in battle and persecution. But their trials wrought their purification, and the evil days were not to last forever. There was a God-appointed time of the end. Now, in 36 through 39, many premillennialists assert that verses 36 and 37 refer to the Antichrist, about whom we supposedly read in the book of Revelation, even though the name, the word Antichrist is not found there. It's only found in the letters of John. And the word Antichrist is a Bible term, but as we've said before, it is used as a term to denote any person that does not believe that Jesus came into the world as God in the flesh. You can read these things in 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 and 22, 1 John chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and 2 John chapter 7. Now, it is certain that Antichrist is not limited to one particular person, because in the first century, according to 2 John 7, there were already many Antichrists. So, this cannot be the Antichrist being referred to here in verses 36 and 37. Again, there is no particular person that is called that. Now, the context of these verses in Daniel 11 show that this is simply a continuation of the discussion of the horrible deeds of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and therefore cannot be the Antichrist. Now, Macias adds this on verses 36 to 39. He says, besides being a selfish and self-centered man, he also thought of himself as being a god. Antiochus Epiphanes had no regard for the true God or for anyone except himself. The only God that Antiochus Epiphanes respected and revered was the God of war, the God of military forces, and the God of finances that were necessary to maintain these forces. This brings us to the final verses of chapter 11, verses 40 through 45. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen and with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. But these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountains. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. All right, are these verses again speaking in a summary fashion about Antiochus Epiphanes, or do they point to someone else? Now, it's difficult in every instance to find historical evidence to apply this section to Antiochus. Yet, if it does not have reference to Antiochus, then its meaning is unclear. As Young says, those interpreters who do not apply these verses to Antiochus refer them to the Romans or to the Antichrist. We've already seen that the idea of an Antichrist being referred to here is not correct. Now there are those. There's one person who thinks, and I'm sure there's others, but one who thinks these verses refer to the Roman Empire wrote the following. He says, without doubt, at first glance, verse 36 seems to refer to Antiochus, the subject of the preceding verses. To me, the difficulties involved in finding a new kingdom or king in verses 36 to 45, while not totally absent in any, are indeed fewer in some than in attempting to apply them to Antiochus. If this is the case, who then is the most likely ruler or empire under consideration? I suggest that the answer that makes the most sense is the Roman Empire for at least three reasons. Number one, the king of verse 36 is the king of the north. The Seleucid Empire was thus referred to because it was to the north when compared with the Egyptian Empire of the Ptolemies to the south. When compared with the king of the south, as to direction, Rome could also be appropriately called the king of the north. Secondly, remember that the period covered by the book of Daniel embraces the time from the Babylonian Empire to some time in the Roman Empire, during which God would set up his eternal kingdom. To end the book with Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire would be anticlimactic, drawing the book to a close without the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, the very source of Israel's hope. And thirdly, to identify the king of verse 36 with anyone after the Roman Empire, whether it be the Antichrist, Muhammad, the popes, or others, this runs beyond the boundaries of the book of Daniel, as earlier shown. We conclude with McGuigan, there is nothing in the text which the Romans couldn't and didn't do. This all comes from Dub McClish in the Southwest Lectureship book, the book of Daniel, on his chapter on Daniel 12. Now, regarding Daniel 11:45, McClish further wrote this: the Roman authorities are described as being in such a position of power that they can set up their standards at will, including Judah. This I believe to be the meaning of planting the tents of his palace between the sea and the precious holy mountain. Although the Roman power would seem invincible, as had the previous empires, Daniel was not to think it to be indestructible. The time would also come when it would perish, with none to rescue it. Now, others insist that the last verses of chapter 11 continue to describe Antiochus Epiphanes. Turner says this, he says, Daniel 11:40 through 45 is with little doubt a recapitulation or overview of the high points of the revelations given in verses 10 through 39. The chief subject of the recapitulation is Antiochus IV. Now, as far as Antiochus Epiphanes goes, what do we know about his last days? Well, Young makes these comments. He says, we know that Antiochus, upon learning of the successful revolt of the Maccabeans, left half the army with Lysias, his governor, to destroy Israel. With the other half, he himself set out toward Persia, where he attempted to take the treasures of a rich city, but was frustrated by its forewarned inhabitants. Hence, he set out for Babylon without the treasure which he needed for the prosecution of his wars against Israel. Word came to him that Lysias had been overthrown and the altar of the Lord re-erected in Jerusalem, whereupon in terror and dismay he fell sick and died. This information was taken by Young from 1 Maccabees 3:27 to 37, 1 Maccabees 6:1 through 16, and Polybius 31:11. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 12, or chapter 11. Let's go on to chapter 12 and hopefully finish the book within this hour of this session. Now, before we get into reading the text, we need to make some comments. Despite the difficulty of this chapter, there are some lessons that are clearly set forth in it. Observe that those that are found written in the book shall be delivered. As we will get into and read this, we will see that those that are written in the book will be delivered. Throughout the Bible, there is reference to the names of the faithful being written in a book, and these God shall save. Number one, it is God's book, according to Exodus 32:32, and this book is found in heaven, according to Luke 10 and verse 20. It is called the Book of Life in several passages, Philippians and Revelation. And the fact is that names can be blotted out, taken away from this book, Exodus 32:32 and Revelation 3 and verse 5. But what about one whose name is not in this book? Revelation 20:15 says, "And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." Next, notice, according to verse 2 of Daniel 12, there is such a thing as everlasting life. And how foolish for a person to live his life on the planet Earth as if physical life is all that matters. Daniel 12:2 shows that this concept was revealed at least in Daniel's time. Thus, yes, there was a concept of life everlasting among God's people in the Old Testament era. And life eternal is obtained, in fact, in the world to come. Mark 10:29 and 30, and it is that for which we hope. Titus chapter 1 and verse 2. Next, notice that there is such a thing as the resurrection, and after it there will be a separation, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. There is such a thing as a spiritual resurrection, just as the Jews, or such as the Jews being brought back to their homeland. Ezekiel 28:25, Ezekiel 34:11 through 15, and Ezekiel 37:1 through 14. Now, there will be the bodily resurrection from the dead when Christ comes again, according to John 5:28 and 29. But there is also, we see in this chapter, in verse 3, there is the great work of turning people to righteousness. Proverbs 11 and verse 30 says, he that wins souls is wise. And the righteousness of God, that is, how to be righteous in His sight, is now revealed through the gospel of Christ, Romans 1:16 and 17. Turning people unto God that they may receive forgiveness of sins was the task of the Apostle Paul, according to Acts 26:18, and therefore should be the concentrated effort of every child of the living God. Now in verse 7 we see the holy people spoken of. The holy people of Jehovah are His faithful servants. In the Old Testament era, the Israelite nation was counted as God's holy nation, or people, Exodus 19:5 and 6, and Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 through 8. In the Christian era, the followers of the Christ, the church, are God's holy people, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Now, sometimes the prophets of old heard God's message and faithfully delivered it to the people. But in the process, they themselves did not fully understand the meaning of the message. That's why we have what is in verse 8, but also what we have in 1 Peter 1, verses 10 through 12, where it says that even the angels desire to look into the mysteries of God. Now, McClish makes this comment on verses 1 through 11. He says, God is able to see the future as clearly as the past. Now, let's get into the text and read verses 1 through 4. Now at that time Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Now, this is a message from a messenger of Jehovah, Michael, the archangel, and the message is about the future of Daniel's people. A wide variety of ideas and approaches have been set forth concerning the basic meaning of this section. What we need to understand is that any approach or explanation that contradicts historical facts or does not harmonize with other plain Bible passages must be rejected. Any approach that is consistent with historical facts and does not contradict other Bible passages should be considered and tolerated, though we might not personally wholeheartedly endorse it. There are 4 approaches that we want to look at here. Approach number 1 is that this section is a continuation from the end of chapter 11, and at least part of the message of chapter 12 applies to the affairs of Antiochus Epiphanes and his dealings with the Jews. Approach number 2 is held by premillennial advocates. As they so often do, they see the fulfillment of these verses in the so-called Great Antichrist. Again, this is really the whole chapter. They see these verses fulfilled in the so-called Great Antichrist, whom they say will fight against and persecute the people of God. One premillennialist stated this. He said, there can be no doubt about it that the time referred to in this verse is coincident with that of the events last spoken of. It is the time of the Great Tribulation, the time of the last Antichrist. The quotation that our Lord makes of this verse in Matthew 24, 21, and 22, with reference to the end of time, clinches the matter for us beyond the possibility of a doubt. That is H.C. Leupold, quoted by Rex Turner Sr. on page 286 of his commentary. Now, as we've seen in our earlier studies of Daniel, premillennialism is false, and there is no one individual identified in the Bible as the great or last Antichrist. So approach number 2 can be disregarded. Now, approach number 3 is as follows. It refers to the events that led up to and included the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. In spite of Michael's help, McClish says this, in spite of Michael's help, this would be a time of terrible trouble for God's people, such as never was seen since there was even to that same time. To what could this refer except the terrible clashes between the Jews and the Romans in the Roman occupation of Palestine that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem as a city and of Israel as a nation in AD 70. One cannot read this without remembering that the Lord used almost these very words to describe that selfsame destruction. For then shall be great tribulation, such as hath not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever shall be. Matthew 24:21. Now, along these same lines, Jim McQuiggan noted, if we will regard the "at that time" phrase in 12:1 as speaking of the time Rome had established her authority in Judah, we do not have far to look for the time of the Great Tribulation. And what does Michael stand up for? To keep a protective eye over the children of God. That is his special function as we can see from the descriptive phrase, the great prince who standeth for the children of God. Now, this is quoted by Rex Turner from McGuigan on page 286 of Turner's commentary. Finally, there is approach number 4. This section goes back to and ties in with what is written in chapter 10 and verse 14, according to this view. Turner says this, he says, while there is no seeming connection between the closing verses of chapter 11 and the opening 3 verses of chapter 12, the case is that content-wise there is a very good relationship in the theme of chapter 10 and the opening verses of chapter 12. To illustrate, in Daniel 10:14, a man clothed in linen reported to Daniel, now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for the vision is yet for many days. All right, let's discuss then the text specific. Verse 1, the term thy people has been used by God's messengers to Daniel before. And in those earlier instances it had reference to the Jews. It would seem natural that it would have reference to the Jews in chapter 12 and verse 1 as well. Turner says, and at that time, that is at a later time, at time long after the evil work of the Samaritans had passed, in essence there would be no holiday or course of ease for Daniel's people. Their course of life would be hard, and that throughout the coming centuries, including the righteous people of other nations, and extending on into the church age and unto the end of the world, there would be, however, a viable and comforting end to the discouraging mechanisms of Satan, predicted or predicated on faith and obedience. Now others take the term thy people, or your people, to refer to Christians. McClish says this, God's true people would be delivered at this time of terror and tribulation. This is not speaking of the literal Jews, but of God's people through his Son, and that is Christians. When the Christ died on the cross, the Old Testament was taken out of the way, Colossians 2:14, thus ending God's covenant relationship with the Jews as a race of people. I believe, he says, those referred to as thy people who would be delivered because they were found written in the book were the Christians who escaped Jerusalem before it fell. Indeed, the Lord provided the very signs by which his people would be able to recognize the end, and he told them to flee the city for their lives when they appeared. That's Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, and Matthew 24:15 to 21. And that's quoted from McClish on page 214 of his writing. Now, concerning the time element of the predicted events of verse 1, McQuiggan wrote this. He said, the scope of the book has consistently been from Babylon at the earliest to Rome at the latest. See this in chapters 2 and 7. In chapter 8, we go from Persian to the Seleucids. In chapter 9, we went from Persia to Rome. In chapters 10 through 12, we do the same thing, from Persia to Rome. That's quoted from McGuigan by McClish on page 210 of his writing. There's another reference here, or the reference also is found in verse 1 concerning the book of life. That's everyone who is found written in the book. We've already discussed that, so we'll leave it. Now verse 2. Many suggest that this verse has reference to the bodily resurrection at the end of time, citing the following facts and reasoning. The phrase, them that sleep, sometimes has reference to the dead, John chapter 11, 1 Thessalonians 4. The dust of the earth sometimes refers to the grave, Genesis 3:19 and Ecclesiastes 12:7. And many that sleep, the word many is used because when Christ comes again, not all people will be in the grave. Some will still be living. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 52, and 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. Also, the word many sometimes means all, as in Romans 5:15, where Paul says, for if by the trespass of the one the many died, much more did the grace of God abound unto the many. Now, it is a fact that after the resurrection from the dead, there will be a separation. Some going into life everlasting and some into everlasting condemnation. We find this in John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, and Matthew 25, verse 46. And the fact is that the Israelite people did believe in the resurrection from the dead, according to 2 Samuel 12, 20 through 23, and John 11, 23 and 24. Now others suggest that this verse, verse 2, refers to a spiritual or symbolic resurrection of the Jewish people. McClish makes this comment. He says, "We have emphasized what is the terminal point of the material in the book of Daniel. In general, sometime during the Roman Empire, in particular, as demonstrated earlier, per chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, this refers to the year AD 70. To throw in a passage on the general resurrection here would be just that, something thrown in, out of place, and isolated from every other part of the book. The text says, many, not all, shall awake from their graves. Although there seemed to be no ray of light to pierce their dark existence and future, Ezekiel was given a message of hope to deliver to them. This was accomplished not only through explicit promises, but through the dramatic vision of the resurrected dry bones in chapter 37. Could it be that Daniel and Ezekiel both describe the ultimate revival of Israel in God's plan? Restoration to Canaan, the coming of the Messiah, the establishment of the eternal kingdom in terms of a resurrection. I believe this is precisely the case. This resurrection occurred when Christ came and established his everlasting spiritual kingdom. The great trouble and tribulation of Daniel 12:1 that literal Israel suffered in AD 70 was payment in kind of God's wrath for their rejection of the true king and his kingdom. That is according to McClish on pages 215 and 216. Now in verses 3 and 4, wise is the one that turns people from sin unto righteousness, is the phrase that is used here. That phrase is not used there, but it speaks of turning people from sin unto righteousness. Young makes this comment on this passage. He says, the words, therefore, are the words which have just been revealed and which Daniel has just written down, but the book evidently includes more than these words. Else, why should this designation have been chosen? Evidently, Daniel had written down his revelations as he received them. This last revelation formed a conclusion in the entire body. The book was now to be sealed. That is his comment on verse 4. Now let's read verses 5 through 7. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And the one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, How long will it be until the end of these wonders? I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So two messengers of the Lord spoke with the messenger that was revealing things to Daniel. And it is likely that the river that is spoken of here is the Tigris. The man clothed in linen would be the messenger of Jehovah that had been speaking to Daniel about the future of his people in verse 6, and also back in chapter 10 and verse 5. Now the normal practice was to raise one hand, the right one, in taking an oath. Here the angel raises both. Does that imply that the oath is more sure? I don't know. Many take the time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 times, to be equivalent of 3.5 years. But as we've noted in our discussion on chapter 7 and verse 25, there is no reason to insist that it means a literal 3.5 year period of time. The 3.5 times may be hard to decipher, but there can be little doubt about when the power of the holy people was broken. It was when the incomparable trouble and tribulation of the awful destruction of Rome was unleashed on Judah and Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, what is meant then by the 3.5 times? Well, we first encounter this symbolic number, as we say it in Daniel 7:25, and it is almost universally understood to mean 3.5 years. It, or its equivalent in days or months, is found several times in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13. Now, the earliest biblical incident that is expressed in this time period is the literal period of 3.5 years in which Elijah was a fugitive from the wrath of Ahab and Jezebel. McGuigan, this is found in 1 Kings 17, verse 1 through 18:46, and it's also referenced in James 5 and verse 17. McGuigan points out the fact that in each of these episodes related to a 3.5 year period, there is this common theme. It is a time when God's people are suffering, but are still sustained by God in their suffering. Given the fact that 7 is the number of completeness and perfection in the Bible, he theorized that 3.5 stands for something incomplete, short of totality or absoluteness. In each case tied to this time frame, there is a fiendish power which seemed absolute and invincible, persecuting God's people. However, it is represented by a number which is far short of absoluteness, in fact only half of it. It falls half of 7. The message, according to McGuigan, then, is that in spite of all appearances, no earthly power is absolute, and they will all eventually fall. When applied to Daniel 12:7, this means that although the Roman Empire would seem to be, in its utter crushing and scattering of the Jews, so powerful that it would stand without end, like its predecessors, it was incomplete and limited both in power and duration. This is quoted from McLeish. Now, whereas some would apply the term holy people to the physical nation of the Jews, in the New Testament we learn that the true followers of the Christ are saints, literally holy ones. Philippians 1:1, Acts 9:13 and 14, and other passages. The church is also called the holy nation of the Lord, 1 Peter 2, verses 5 and 9. Now McLeish says, remember, whatever might be the meaning of these numbers, they must be understood as bringing us no further down the stream of time than the breaking in pieces of the power of the holy people, which would be AD 70. Finally, let's read verses 8 through 13. As for me, I heard but could not understand, so I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? He said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. But those who have insight will understand. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. So Daniel asks the meaning of what he just heard and how it will all end. Many assume that the end of these things and the end of time in verses 8 and 9 refer to the end of the world. The context has to determine the meaning, and the context defines this to be related to the taking away of the daily sacrifice and the things that followed. Daniel is told to go on his way, seemingly meaning that since these matters are sealed, they are definitely going to happen and there is no need for him to fret over them. Besides, he should take comfort in the fact that he has already been informed that the faithful shall be delivered and be raised to everlasting life. Now, in the affairs involved, many would be wise and understand, and as a result would be purified and made white. Verse 10. On the other hand, the wicked shall do wickedly. That is referred to in verse 10. Now, who was it that took away the daily sacrifice? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes did it, as we've already noted in our study of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. That took place in the year 167 BC. Many point to this as the fulfillment of Daniel 12:11, citing the similarity of language in the close context, especially just back in chapter 11, verse 31. But consider the removal of the daily sacrifice from another angle. Jesus, by his death on the cross, removed the need for any animal sacrifices to be made as per the law of Moses. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 12. In fact, those sacrifices as part of the Old Testament system were done away with and no longer part of God's scheme or will for mankind. Hebrews 10:9 and Colossians 2:14. However, animal sacrifices continued to be offered in the Jews' temple until its destruction in AD 70, after which time even the Jews that rejected the gospel could no longer make sacrifices according to the Old Covenant. Now note these points. Well, let me just say this about that last section. This would make then the removal of sacrifice, if it wasn't plain from what we read, this would make the removal of sacrifice to be the time of the Romans destroying Jerusalem and the temple. But now I want you to note several things. While Antiochus interrupted the daily sacrifices of the temple and profaned the sacred precincts of the temple, so did the Romans under Titus when they destroyed the city and the temple in AD 70. Second, while Antiochus brought grave suffering on the Jews, he did not finally break in pieces their power. The Maccabeans arose in rebellion against Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, and their efforts eventually resulted in restoring a measure of Jewish independence which continued even till the birth of Christ. But it was the Romans, not Antiochus, who broke in pieces the power of the Jews as a nation. Thirdly, the Lord, as already noticed, applied the abomination of desolation phrase to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in Matthew 24:15. His description in Luke's parallel account defines that the desolation he had in mind very specifically was when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. We've already noted that, Luke 21:20. Fourthly, Matthew and Mark must have known that Jesus was referring to words and therefore events from Daniel 12, as demonstrated by their parenthetical statement, "Let him that readeth understand," which was found immediately after his warning about the abomination of desolation, Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14. Notice how closely this resembles what the messenger said to Daniel in the same breath with his reference to the cessation of the continual burnt offering and the abomination of desolation. He said, "But they that are wise shall understand." Or in verse 10, "But those who have insight will understand." Now, concerning the 1290 days, these began from the time of the taking away of the daily sacrifice and abomination of desolation. If these matters end with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, then the 1290 days go beyond that. If the 3.5 years connected with the scattering of the holy people is symbolic, then why wouldn't this 1290 days be symbolic also? Now, just what the 1290 days is not defined in the text, but for sure they would come after the fulfillment of the above noted affairs. Again, the 1355 days noted in verse 12 are undefined, but going along with the above, this would appear to be symbolic. The key thought in verse 12 appears to be the idea that that blessed is the one that waits, perseveres, and faithfully serves through anything that may come his or her way. Now the last verse is a message of comfort for Daniel, assuring him that he shall rest and then be blessed. There is a rest for those that die in the Lord, Revelation 14:13 and Hebrews 4:1 through 11. And Daniel would receive his lot, a symbol of that which God hands out in judgment, according to Jeremiah 13:25. Now the New King James will arise to your inheritance in verse 13. And the fact is that life in heaven is referred to as an inheritance in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Well, as we close the last chapter of this thrilling, though at times perplexing book, we are reminded that Daniel was a man greatly beloved, a man that Jehovah considered to be among the best. And may the Lord help us to learn from this man of God. I hope you have learned much from this study. If you have any questions, please let me know. It's been a joy to have you in class. Thank you.